There's this great episode of The Andy Griffith Show. In this show, Barney Fife, Andy's deputy, tries out for the Mayberry Community Choir. And he doesn't just try out for the choir, he tries out for the soloist position, for a tenor solo. Well, the problem here is that everybody but Barney realizes that he's not a good fit for the solo because he's not a great tenor soloist. But he's got this exaggerated sense of his own abilities. Well, that may be funny for a sitcom, but maybe it's not as funny when it happens in real life. And I'm not talking about at the Thanksgiving table when Uncle Ted shares and expounds about things he really doesn't know about and everyone kind of yesses him to death. I'm talking about in real life and in institutional life, when there are things that we say we do really well, but we haven't really examined whether or not that is actually true. Exaggerated sense of ability or prowess at something. They developed this concept called the dunning-kruger effect. And it basically says someone or an institution thinks they're a whole lot better at something than they really are. Well, how does this play out or apply to us as Christian schools? Well, we make some pretty bold promises as Christian schools, don't we? I mean, you look at any of our vision or mission statements blazed across our websites, and you'll find statements like, we produce students with a strong biblical worldview, able to defend it in the marketplace of ideas. Now, that is a lofty goal and a worthy goal, too. But I wonder, are we suffering from the dunning-kruger effect? Are we saying we're really good at something without really having the evidence to back up that we actually are? Well, Dunning-Kruger discovered that the key to not having an over-exaggerated sense of your ability is to have good self-awareness. And that's a lot of what this book is about, developing self-awareness as leaders, as educators, and as entire school communities to say, hey, are we really good at this mission that we say we're good at? Well, I'll tell you right up front, I think we've got some work to do. We can all grow in our ability to raise up students who really do have a strongly developing biblical worldview. I want to tell you 3 quick stories and 1 quick statistic that will help make my point. First of all, about 12 years ago, I was speaking at a well-established Christian school that would have had all the same kind of mission statements that I just said before. And I was talking about biblical worldview. Well, after a couple of sessions, one of the teachers came over to me and he said, Roger, I appreciate what you're saying. Everything's great. But can you tell me, what is a worldview? Yeah, this is a veteran teacher in a school that said they produce students with a strong biblical worldview, and he didn't even know what a worldview was. The very person who was entrusted with helping students to develop a biblical worldview wasn't really that conversant in it. Number 2. At another place, I was talking with a teacher, an upper school teacher, and I just, in kind of an offhanded way, asked this teacher, hey, what have you been reading lately? Because my sense is good teachers will be readers, just like leaders are readers, and we're always developing ourselves. Well, this teacher, who was known as a very good teacher, said, I'd like to read more, but I really don't have much time to do so. I think that's a problem for Christian school teachers. My third story is this. I was at a conference myself listening to a worldview expert talk about how to teach biblical worldview. And the expert focused mainly on the content of a biblical worldview, and he was teaching it very well. Well, I raised my hand and I asked a question. I said, I love what you're saying. This all makes sense. But given that a biblical worldview is true, and we should be teaching it to our kids, how should that impact the way we teach? There was kind of an awkward silence before he said, well, Roger, I hadn't really thought of that. So these couple of stories show us that maybe we're not as good as we think we are at teaching kids to develop a biblical worldview. My final thought on this is a statistic that I read recently from some current research that says upwards of 60% of college professors in Christian colleges and universities say they either don't know or they're not aware of how their belief system impacts their pedagogy. 60%, almost 2 out of 3 college professors at Christian colleges really don't make a connection between their values, what they believe, and how they actually teach. So the premise of Beyond Biblical Integration is that we need to become more self-aware in this process, and that there are things we can learn and do that will help us to begin delivering on our promises. And really, there's 5 key things that we'll unpack in the book and in our time together. First of all, what we need are teachers and leaders who are actively developing their own biblical worldview. You certainly can't pass on what you don't have. And actually, the process of developing your worldview has a way of rubbing off on those around you, and I'll tell you more about that later. The second is that we really need to understand and apply some thought to how a worldview actually develops in people. Is there a model that helps us understand how a child goes from an infant to a young adult and actually develops their worldview over time? Well, there is, and we can learn a lot about how to teach from that. And that's really my third point, that we would look at all of our teaching and learning expectations and ideals and make sure it's consistent with a developmental model for biblical worldview. Number 4, we need to look at everything we do in the classroom and out of the classroom in our schools and make sure it aligns with the big picture meta-narrative that the Bible offers us for all of creational history. And we've all heard it, it's creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. I use some other words for that, which I'll share with you later, but we really have to connect everything we're doing to God's big picture story of all of creation. And then finally, we need leaders in Christian schools who will do things that will help to cultivate an ethos of biblical worldview development in their school by equipping their teachers, by encouraging their teachers, and setting high expectation for teachers in this particular regard. I'd like to close this session with a quick metaphor, which I did not come up with, and I borrowed it from David Smith's book on Christian teaching. As he looked through the history of teaching, he discovered this concept of a pedagogium. It's in the Middle Ages, the master teacher wouldn't teach from a lecture necessarily. He or she would actually invite the students to come and live with them. That's right. They'd open the doors to their home and say, come and live with the master, and we're going to live life together, and we're going to teach and learn together what we need to teach and learn. And so literally students would come and live with the master teacher. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of your second graders move in with you, although, hey, maybe that would be a good way to really pass on a biblical worldview. But what I am suggesting is that we look more and more at our classrooms like places that we invite students into to live and learn with us, rather than places where we get up in front and deliver lectures and lessons. It's a different way of looking at our classroom, but it's a way that's faithful to how God has designed us as human beings to develop a biblical worldview. And if that's what we say we do, if that's the promise we say we offer to parents, we better be sure that we're very self-aware of how we're doing with that, and that we set a clear pathway to becoming better and better at helping our students to develop a biblical worldview.